very warm welcome to Policy Watch, our weekly program that seeks to keep you abreast of all the major macroeconomic developments this week. This week, the three stories that we've chosen for discussion are the government's decision to auction coal blocks, the Petroleum Minister Veerappa Moili's partial about turn on diesel deregulation and what it means for our oil import bill. And last but not the least, the government's ultimate election sop to its employees, the announcement of the 7th Pay Commission. And joining me to discuss all this is Soma Banerjee, National Policy Editor, Economic Times. Welcome to the show, Soma.
Hello.
Well, after all the sound and fury occasioned by the irregularities in the allotment of coal blocks, or Coalgate as it has come to be known, and the subsequent impasse in policy that followed, the government has finally decided to move ahead with the auction of coal blocks to private producers of steel, cement and power. Will this help increase domestic coal output and reduce our coal imports? Remember, India has the third largest reserves of coal in the world, so there must be something gravely amiss if we still have to import coal at a time when we're finding it difficult to finance our current account deficit. We'll ask Soma for a take on all this, but first, the Bureau Report.
On Tuesday, the Cabinet approved allocation of coal blocks by competitive bidding. Under the new rules, the blocks will be offered on a production-linked payment basis on a rupee per ton mechanism. Successful bidders will have to pay 10% of the intrinsic value of the coal block upfront. Once they win, the bidders get 2 years to explore and 5 years to develop the coal blocks. They could get penalized if they surrender blocks without performing detailed exploration and submitting mining plan. The firms also have to obtain mining lease from respective state governments. The Ministry of Environment and Forest will review the details of the coal blocks before auctioning them. The government is expected to auction 4 coal blocks with nearly 2,000 million tons of estimated reserves. In all, the Coal Ministry has identified 12 mines for the power sector and 24 for steel and cement companies. For the regulated power sector, a 90% discount is being provided to tariff-based bidding. Further, both the ministry and the bidder will agree to perform specified minimum work at all stages. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Soma, every cloud has a silver lining, it would seem, because after all the noise about the Coalgate scam, we still haven't seen the end of it. Does it seem that the government has now been forced to go in for auctions? Because in 2005 also, the policy actually did allow auctions, but the government chose to go through that very non-transparent means of a screening committee.
Yeah.
So do you think, what has changed? Is this a positive fallout of Coalgate?
Well, yes, we can't say it's not a positive fallout, because ultimately this leads to transparency in allocation of natural resources. It's sad that the government took so long to come to coal, because a similar thing has happened in the oil sector or in mining. So therefore, in other sectors, they've already gone through this process of auctioning out natural resources to bidders who can develop it, and particularly when they're opening up to the private sector. So yes, it has come late, but it's welcome, because it's finally going to move towards a transparent mechanism by which the government has to let out natural resources, development of natural resources to the private as well as.
But in India, very often we have seen even the most foolproof auctions. There is a way of rigging these, and somehow we seem very good at it.
Sure.
So, what do you think are the biggest impediments to having a really foolproof auction, transparent, where the best man wins?
I think the biggest impediment today is the absence of a regulator. You do not have a coal regulator in place. You've talked about it. I think there is a cabinet decision to set it up, but there is no such clarity as to how this regulator is going to perform. And as we have seen,
yeah, absolutely. You see, all the regulators are
ex-bureaucrats. You've seen with most regulators we have in place, they are ex-bureaucrats. They are people often with not much knowledge about the sector.
And no independence, it would seem.
And no independence, which is the biggest problem. So therefore, that is where the whole crux of this lies. Because auction by itself, I mean, we have enough reports and now enough experience in other sectors to see how we can fend off those kind of problems. But what you need once you let go, once you have an auctioning process, is a very independent and a very knowledgeable regulator who can pull the levers as and when it is required. So the biggest impediment, I think, is we're kind of putting the cart before the horse. And I can understand why that is so, because as you know, that energy is a big crisis area, and you mentioned it yourself, which is very true. the fact that we are importing coal after being such a big
it's
reserve
really
country.
almost criminal.
Yeah,
isn't
it's spending forex to really import coal while you're sitting on all of it in the country is.
So the way I see auctions, I think there are two biggest problems with auction. One is the winner's curse, where people in a desperate bid in order to get that coal block will bid very high and then subsequently ask for concessions. We've seen that happening again and again in infrastructure. That is the first problem. And the second problem really is that it says production linked payments. Now we've seen that in the case of Reliance and the gas basin, because whenever the price becomes unfavorable, somehow mysteriously the production falls. Now whether this is because of natural reasons or because you don't want to kind of produce at a price which is seen as not favorable, how does one tackle both these issues?
You know, Mythili, there are two things over here which I would like to say. One is we can't take away the fact of a geological risks whenever we are dealing with natural resources like coal or like oil or gas.
That is a business risk, so why should government come to the aid?
Yeah, so I guess with all the experience and particularly the recent scams that have come out or the allegations that have come out, it will make bidders think very hard and very properly before they actually submit their work program or their discovery. So you take a bid for exploration, then you get about 2 years, I think, for the exploration work, and then they have to submit a plan. Now, it is at this point that you actually commit yourself to how much you are going to produce, and that is based on your exploration work. Now, the recent case in the natural gas sector, the Reliance Industries case, which you've mentioned, is today even being debated. Even today, people are not sure if Reliance really does not have the gas or is it just deliberately doing it for price. Now, while that question remains a very pertinent question, particularly since you have committed a lot of things based on this in future. So I think companies will have to become much more, my gut feel is, in fact, even with Reliance and people in the oil sector now, I see them actually under-declaring because they are fearing this to happen, So if they know, and this is what ONGC would do earlier. So if they know there is 20 MMBTU of gas, they probably say 18 or 15, keeping these risks in mind. But more than that, what I'm a little bit skeptical about, and I'm not too sure how they're going to do about, is the work program. In the oil sector, we saw that a lot of weightage was given on the work program. Work program essentially means how much of work you're going to do. In the oil sector is about drilling wells. Each well is very, very capital intensive. So what happened then was people bid outrightly and to a large extent much more than what they would actually do to get the points out there.
So should the government be flexible in binding them to that, or should it be very rigid and say, look, this was what your work plan was. If you have in any way fallen short, you have to be penalized.
This is exactly why I say that you need a very technically competent regulatory system because, see, we are dealing with the unknowns over here.
Absolutely.
Sometimes they are true, sometimes they are false, and that is where the technical guys can come in and see whether the company is actually duping you, they're not doing their work, they probably diverted the money they have raised for this, or are they really caught in a technical problem because these are reservoirs under the ground and you may have some shocks. But it's important for the bidders or for the players to know that they have a system which is going to come down heavily if you're playing around. But there is also an incentive for doing better. So, then there is a check as well as a balance, in the sense there's an incentive if you can do better. And it doesn't, see, the point is, it's not just about drilling more wells or drilling more area. It's about, you have to link it to this much money putting and that much coming out. So again, if you have people who are not technically competent, they probably badger you that you're supposed to drill 80 wells, you've drilled only 40 wells. But if they are going on drilling dry wells and each well is about $250 million, then what are we trying to achieve?
And should you also have some requirement, the people who bid should be people in that particular sector or related sectors where you can use that coal? Because we saw in the case of telecom, we saw real estate companies getting into spectrum auction only to grab it and sit on it. So do you think you should have something like that?
Yeah, but at the moment I think it is limited to power, cement and...
absolutely, but then what about new companies getting into that saying we hope to set up a power plant, we hope to set up a steel plant? Can one really prevent that from happening?
Yeah, I mean, see, this is again, it's an egg and chicken situation, in the sense there are a lot of companies who probably, particularly foreign guys who are miners, who basically just develop mines, but they don't have any downstream plans. So, I mean, would you then want those people to come in to actually just get into coal mining? They may not have downstream plans. But what's important is then to see if there is a utility policy or if there is a policy of how the coal would be sold or how it would be marketed.
Do you anticipate interest from overseas investors in something like this?
Actually, see, Mythili, I mean, if they are not coming in, it is because of our problems in the regulatory
Flip-flop
system
policy.
and the policies and the tax incentives. We just are not consistent. I mean, imagine a country, I mean, we are like little Saudi Arabia sitting as far as coal is concerned. So
absolutely.
any big mining company, any big mining major in the world, I mean, the Australian companies, they're all waiting for India as a market. But the problem is that we are not consistent in our policies. We've taken so long to start this. We're not yet decided on whether we want to really deregulate the coal sector, whether we want market prices. We have auction prices, yet we go back to this. So there's just too much of...
So should one wait for the regulator to come first, or should we open up and then hope for the regulator?
No, I think very firmly we need to have the regulator in place. We cannot have the coal ministry and the government doing the job of a regulator when you're opening up for auction.
One last question before we go into a break. Given the fact that we've seen so many politicians getting allotments last time, should we say no politician should be allowed to bid?
I mean, I wish we could all do all of that, but as we know, politicians never take things in their name, and so you probably have many more layers to go before that happens.
So on that note, so I have to interrupt you. We'll slip into a short break, but we'll be back very soon. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Given the glacial pace of government's move towards oil sector deregulation and the impending elections, a U-turn was always on the cards. And sure enough, Petroleum Minister Veerappa Moily has now done a partial U-turn, saying bulk buyers who were earlier required to buy their supplies at the market price will once again get fuel at the subsidized price. Is the government banking on a thaw in US-Iran relations to help us contain our oil import bill, or is it all about populism, as many of us fear? Let's get Soma in on this, but first, a bureau report.
Good news for state transport utilities. If the petroleum minister has his way, then they may not have to pay market rates for diesel anymore. Already groaning under losses, the utilities were further burdened since January when Supreme Court asked bulk consumers to pay market rates for diesel. Upholding the government's decision, the court said subsidies cannot continue forever. State transport utilities are complaining that at current rates they are paying 14.5 rupees more than retail for a litre of diesel. And without a comparable tariff hike, their losses are skyrocketing. More good news for utilities. The minister has also ruled out any plan to raise fuel prices for now. Another significant fallout for India's energy security is the thaw in US-Iran relations this week. American sanctions on Tehran's petroleum sector had compelled India to cut down oil imports from Iran drastically. All that could change now. With better US-Iran relations ending a 34-year standoff, the global oil prices could cool down, providing an answer to India's energy needs. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Soma, does that mean finito to the oil sector deregulation, all the reforms in that sector? Or is the government just realizing that dual pricing was always a bad idea to begin with?
You know, I don't think we can say the last word on the petroleum sector ever. This is something which will go on, and as we've seen, it's always a very handy tool for politicians. As far as dual pricing is concerned, I don't think it was a very bad idea to start with. You know, it was about getting the big users to pay the right price and moving the retailers to move into it.
Those who were finally buying at the market price were actually the state government transport undertakings, and the private carriers got away by buying it at the subsidized price. So who uses?
But the point is that the state transport guys as well as the railways, remember, or the army, they were the bulk consumers. So ultimately what one had thought this would be pushed towards the consumer price. So to that extent, you would pay higher bus tickets or higher rail tickets. So instead of actually pinching the consumer directly by buying the diesel, which is not a very big sum if you see just the retail buyers.
But what you're doing, Soma, basically is that the SUV rider, I mean the driver, the owner of the SUV gets subsidized diesel, and the guy who goes by road, guy who goes by railways, who are really the lower middle class and middle class, and the poor, in fact you're penalizing them. So isn't there something odd about this?
No, Mythili, you're very right that we've started through the wrong end. I mean the sense which you said that the SUV guy still gets to buy subsidized diesel. But the idea was to move diesel up to that price. The idea was start with the bulk and then you move, which they were doing till very lately, which is not much, but even a 50 paisa, 70 paisa up every month was helping bridge the gap between the two. But now by going back on the bulk, you've left very little hope for the retail even to move up. So and I really think that this is, you know, the fact that they go back on what they have done sends out the worst kind of signals. I think it's better to be stalemate without decisions than to keep going back on what you've done.
So what is it, because of the elections, 5 assembly elections, general elections?
I mean, I can think of no other reason but for this, because remember that elections and prices is a huge issue. I mean, no matter what we say about other things, it's ultimately the consumer who's going to face the ballot. I mean, go to the ballot box, and for him, his inflation is already skyrocketing, fuel prices going up.
So then is that the petroleum minister versus the finance minister? Because remember, the finance minister has said that he will not exceed that 4.8 number for fiscal deficit. And if you don't hike diesel prices, then it's going to be very difficult to retain, contain your subsidy bill. So how do you do it?
So you know who's going to pay the subsidy? It's going to be ONGC and GAIL and OIL. And like at a time when most oil companies are actually making huge profits, the government is going to give away, or rather forego its huge dividend checks from these companies and allow them to subsidize, because as we know now that there is no under the line budgeting, and so the government can't defer the payments as it used to do earlier. So, and they have very little cash really to pay up to these oil marketing companies, who are forced to pay it sell it at a price which is dictated by the government. So that means that they will meet the subsidy bill by dipping into the coffers of the oil producing companies, who definitely are in a position to pay.
They're making a lot of money. But the government gets that much less revenue. So regardless of whether you do it through the subsidy route or whether the oil
But I think that's the cost they pay, because they're not, they're so scared about going to polls with it. This has always been the poll mechanism, and it continues to be. That's the sad part of it, that they took such a long time to really touch diesel, which has always been a no-no for most governments, and one had thought that this is now going to go on. But by going back on the bulk decision, I think you're only showing what retail would also go.
But they had the courage in the case of petrol, LPG. So what is it about diesel alone that makes the government so worried?
Diesel, like we all know, is the largest consumption petroleum product in this country. It's about 45% of the petroleum product consumption. Now that means that, and it feeds as a raw material of fuel for many things which go on. So food prices, maybe this is also a way of looking at food prices coming down if diesel prices come down, because most public carriers or trucks, would be buying diesel at bulk rates. So if that comes down, they are hoping maybe a little bit of the food prices could come down.
So is it because the government feels a little confident that in case you have a thawing of the relationship between US and Iran, maybe our oil bill will come down, so the government is...
I think that's very far-fetched at this point, because even if things were thawing down, firstly, we have to see how long it takes for sanctions to be really removed. Second is that India really didn't stop importing. It's just that we lowered our imports to some extent, but we were always looking for ways to get it. And more, this is not so much of a supply-demand situation or a issue, because the prices which you see in the global market definitely does not show a supply-demand market. It's all about speculation, or it's about geopolitical risks. So the geopolitical risk factor may come down, and to that extent maybe $2-3 down, but that's about it. So we're not going to see a huge drop in oil prices.
In rupees with Iran, there's not a factor that you can pay with rupees?
There again, there's a huge problem, because we want to pay them only in rupees, but Iran does not have so much of import from India to buy. So at the moment, in fact, the big worry is there's a huge bank account sitting with lots of rupees which is not being used. So how much can you really go on putting in there?
Again, I think I'll have to interrupt you again, Soma, because we have to slip into a very short break, but please stay with us. Welcome back. Election time is a time for freebies. So it's food security for the poor, quote unquote. Never mind if the leaky PDS system means the security is only on paper. It's the promises of yet another bonanza for government employees. Regardless of government denials, the timing of the announcement of the 7th Pay Commission to go into the salaries of government employees is bound to make the decision suspect. Was it really concern for the welfare of government employees whose salaries are already protected against inflation to a large degree? Or is it an indirect way of buying their support, albeit with taxpayer money? Let's see what Soma has to say on this, but first, our Bureau Report.
Barely 2 months ahead of the assembly elections in 5 states, the central government announced the setting up of 7th Pay Commission on Wednesday. Its recommendations would lead to a sharp increase in the salaries of nearly 70 lakh employees and pensioners, although they may have to wait till 2 years after the 2014 Lok Sabha elections to get the benefit. The pay hike of course comes at a huge cost. Like the 6th Pay Commission that was set up in 2006, its reports in March 2008 pushed up employee salaries by 60 to 80%. The award cost the government over 26,000 crore in the first year. It also made the centre miss its fiscal deficit target for that year. This was after the World Bank described the award of its predecessor, the 5th Pay Commission, as the single largest adverse shock to Indian public finances. In the meanwhile, Commerce and Industry Minister Anand Sharma had to say that it is the right of the employees to have pay commission. When the recommendations come, the government will be able to implement it. You do not do something for which you do not have money available. The government will announce the names of the chairperson and other members as well as the terms of reference later. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Soma, are you wishing you were a government employee? Because then you'd get a huge pay hike, complete job security, indexation of, for inflation. So why did the government really announce it? Once again, elections?
Do you think there's any other reason? I can't think of one. In fact, I don't know how Mr. Chidambaram, until and unless he kind of has wished away or he knows that he's not going to come back. Because this will tell in a year or two, and I don't see how they will be in a position by then. See, even the food security bill, as we know, it's not going to kick in full steam this year. So a lot of it is deferred spending for the government, which is going to come on the books or going to come on the spending in a year or two. So I don't see any financial reason why there can be, for this to happen just now. Any justification at all for this to happen just now, because like you said, unlike private sector, government salaries are to some extent inflation.
80% is indexed to inflation.
Yeah.
So, I mean, could the argument be, the argument earlier was that, salaries are not in line with private sector, but actually if you look at it, the middle and the lower rung of government salaries are in fact in excess of the private sector.
Definitely, and the security part, look at the fact that there's so many layoffs nowadays in the private sector, and this has become almost a rule now. I mean, everybody knows downturn and pink slips are going to be given. It doesn't happen in the government sector so easily.
So, and you don't buy the argument that it's going to happen only in 2016. By that time, our finance will improve. So, why are we prejudging it?
It's difficult to think how by 2016 we are going to be really radically departed from where we are today. If at all, the world looks much more difficult as we go along, and our own expenses are only increasing, whereas our revenues really, until unless there's some huge jackpot that we are going to hit, I think this is going to be a big worry for any finance minister who's in the chair then. But yes, politically, I'm sure this will be,
because the last time the fiscal deficit increased from 2.5% of GDP to over 6%, mainly because of the pay commission. So is there something, some contradiction between the government saying that we're going to abide by our fiscal deficit target and repeatedly doing anything but? Because whether you're talking about the food security bill, whether you're talking about the pay commission, the government doesn't seem at all serious about cutting its expenditure.
Mythili, I think here it is the party which takes over the government. I do not think the government really can do very different from what the party wants. And in this place, in this time when, it's going to be a huge election, 2014 is just a few months away, and you have state elections coming up, the government will do everything that is needed for the party to be on a better platform. So I can understand, I'm sure that whether it's the Prime Minister or whether it is Mr. Chidambaram or whether it is Dr. Rangarajan or anybody who has to actually get down to the basics of getting the money, it's a very difficult proposition for them. But I'm sure the party has a different plan altogether, and they have to play by it. And it will be for us to see.
Countries like Greece, because when they were going through a downturn, in fact, what the government did was cut the salaries of the government employees. Whereas in our case, it seems as if government employees are a very cocooned lot. I mean, nothing ever hurts them. Because, I mean, that would be a little, but what could the government have done? Could it have deferred the decision? Or another problem with the pay commission recommendations is that the government always, accepts the hike in salary, but the part about rationalization of staff,
which doesn't happen.
That never happens. So can we really do something about that? Can we bring public pressure? What do you think will make the government more responsible?
This is a very sticky subject for even public pressure, because remember, it means a large section of people who are employed as government servants, and we're not talking just of central government servants, but even state government servants. And there are also, like for instance, PSUs and agencies and departments. So the moment you want to say that cut salaries or rationalize people,
it doesn't work in a democracy. So I think we've come to the end of this program. Thank you very much for being with us. But before we close, a quick look at the key takeaways. As far as the coal auction is concerned, I think Soma is very clear that unless you have a regulator in place first, it really doesn't make sense to open up to auctions, because you'll have a whole lot of issues and the problems just will not go away. As far as a partial U-turn on diesel pricing is concerned, well, she does take a view that it's quite sad that the government, after having picked up the political courage, seems to have finally chickened out, but she feels it was on the cards. When elections are around the corner, then governments do take these decisions who are populist. The same logic once again when it comes to the 7th pay commission. At the time of elections, governments are more than happy to give away, because after all, it is taxpayer money. And with that, we come to the end of this program. Thank you for being with us, but we'll be back same time next week.